This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Adele Reinhartz. Dr. Reinhartz is a professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada and has a distinguished career specializing in early Christianity, Judaism, Jewish and Christian relations, and literary criticism. She is the author of several books and a contributor to the new Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, out now on Eerdmans. Her contribution is entitled Beyond the Jewish Jesus Debate, where she argues that the next phase of historical Jesus research needs to simply assume the Jewish identity of Jesus. We will be discussing this chapter on the show today. Dr. Reinhartz, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, you are one in a long line of scholars that contributed to the Next Quest that I've had on my show. And you write about a topic that I have been very, very passionate about for a long time. It's one of these issues that when I was in ministry, I would always try to convince the people that were in my congregation that they needed to just accept that Jesus was Jewish and learn to live with that. It's so important. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about your chapter because it's brilliant and it covers absolutely every angle of the problem. But before we do that, just introduce yourself to my audience. Tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Okay, well, I'm Adele Reinhartz. I teach at the University of Ottawa in Canada in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. My BA and MA were in Jewish Studies, and then for my doctorate, I switched over to New Testament on the assumption, the correct assumption, that having a strong background in early Jewish texts and history and so on would be helpful in my scholarship on New Testament, and also helpful to my students as if I was so lucky to get a professorship in teaching New Testament, which I was, and so that's a bit about my background. I've worked primarily on the Gospel of John for the last many years, but also in all areas of New Testament, especially in its relationship to the Judaism of the time.
Well, and this is incredibly important for our historical understanding of early Christianity, and there are just so many people that don't seem to grasp and I can't even really call it the Jewish roots of early Christianity, because early Christianity is just Judaism, but I'm so glad that you were able to address this, and your contribution to the Next Quest I think is really a really important foundational idea that people must hold in mind as they're reading the New Testament. I want to talk a little bit more broadly about your relationship to the Next Quest project, which has been going on for a couple of years and kind of culminated in this book. How did you become interested in the Next Quest? And then what motivated you to contribute a chapter on the Jewish identity of Jesus?
Well, I was invited. I was invited to be part of it. And I was asked to write on this exact topic, Beyond the Jewish Jesus Debate. So that's how I became part of it. I don't really normally work on historical Jesus questions, for reasons that I talk about in the chapter as well. So I was happy, but I was happy to contribute to the volume because I think it's important and a good corrective to a lot of the scholarship that's been going on over the last few decades on historical Jesus research. So it was really because I was invited to participate in the project.
Well, it is an excellent chapter, and I want to deal with some of the background issues that you addressed briefly. Obviously, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism has been very complex and convoluted over the centuries. And your title is, your chapter is entitled "Beyond the Jewish Jesus Debate." Now, for those of us that have been reading biblical studies, especially over the last 20, 30, or 40 years, I think it's just been taken for granted by a lot of scholars that Jesus was Jewish, and that should be the default starting point. That hasn't quite bled out into the way that the popular audience understands or perceives Jesus. And obviously there are historical reasons for that. So how has the history of biblical interpretation kind of either rejected or downplayed the Jewish identity of Jesus? How do we get to the point where there are people that just don't understand that Jesus is Jewish?
Well, I think there are lots of factors that have gone into that situation. I think you're right that if you read the scholarship over the last several decades and talk to scholars, there's nobody really that seriously challenges that Jesus was Jewish, but that viewpoint doesn't always make its way out to the general population. I think part of that has to do with the contemporary situation where we see Jews and Christians as very different, where we see Christianity as kind of asserting its identity over against Judaism, and where Jesus is seen as the key figure in Christianity. I think that is a natural perception. But people jump from that perception to then a assumption that as the key figure in Christianity, Jesus was obviously Christian. And if he was Christian, then he wasn't Jewish. Now, historians know that that's actually not the case, that Christianity did not exist as such at the time of Jesus, and not for quite some time after that as well. Jesus didn't really set out to create a new religion in any way. He was a Jewish man who lived as other Jewish men did at the time. But that's a difficult thing to convey to people who aren't encountering the scholarship, or whose pastors, for example, aren't really introducing these kinds of ideas. I think that from the very beginning, we certainly see this development, I think a little bit already in the Gospels, but certainly in patristic literature and later. There was an attempt to figure out or to assert Jesus' uniqueness. And that meant that Jesus had to stand out or be made to stand out from the overall context in which he was raised. And then over time, that turned into a picture where Jesus was over against Judaism. So you find, for example, 19th century scholars building on what earlier theologians had asserted, saying, well, yes, Jesus was born Jewish, but then he rejected Judaism. And so it was all part and parcel, I think, of an attempt to articulate a Christian identity that was distinct from Judaism, a process that began probably really in the 2nd century, but you see the roots of it already in the Gospel of John, for example, in the New Testament.
Yeah, so we have this very interesting dynamic where during the Enlightenment, there was kind of this reawakening of the realization that people around the world had these different cultural contexts, and we had to try to analyze them within their own historical context. But it really took New Testament scholarship until about the 1970s to just fully accept the Jewish identity of Jesus. And I know that when I was going through Bible college in the early 2000s, this was at the height of the popularity of like the new perspective on Paul. And there are definitely problematic ways in which scholars like James Dunn and E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright think about the Jewishness of Jesus. But one of the points that those scholars made was that the reason why it took so long, or one of the major reasons why it took so long for us to reckon with Jesus's Jewish identity, has to go back to the Protestant Reformation itself. And it seems that reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin simply assumed that the problems that they were experiencing with the late medieval Catholic Church were the problems that were inherent in their reading of first century Judaism. They kind of projected their experience of late medieval Catholicism back into first century Judaism. How much of that dynamic is at play? Because I think that there are many people in the Protestant world that might lay a lot of blame at the feet of the reformers for that misunderstanding.
Well, I don't know that I can really speak to that. I'm not a specialist in that period or in the period of the Reformation. I think it's still the case that there are Protestant scholars who conflate Catholicism with traditional Judaism and assume that Judaism in the first century worked the same way as Catholicism does today. I think there are still scholars who make that assumption. But, I can't really speak to the details of how it was that this perception of Jesus' non-Jewishness, let's say, came to be so prominent, because it doesn't begin with Luther. It begins earlier than that. It could be that he was using earlier traditions or earlier attitudes that already existed in order to develop those sorts of ideas. But I think you'd be better off asking a scholar of theologian who's familiar with all of the ins and outs of the Reformation.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that answer, and it is a very, very complex historical story about how we got here. I do know that in the chapter of your book, you kind of lay out three different approaches that the next quest has to take with respects to the Jewishness of Jesus, and one of the statements that you make is that we just have to take it for granted that Jesus was a Jew, and I actually really like the way that James Crossley puts it in his opening chapter, where he just says Jesus was Jewish, full stop. That's the end of the story, and we just have to accept that. And so I want to go over kind of these three approaches, and then maybe some of the sub issues that are related to them. The first one has to do with the matrilineal descent of Jesus. Now, this is something that I don't think that a lot of people within traditional Christian circles have placed a lot of emphasis on, because they're more concerned about these Christological issues about the relationship between Jesus and the Father and things like that. But what does it mean for the significance of Jewish's identity that he was born from Mary? What does that tell us about his Jewish identity?
Well, according to Jewish law, which changed over time, but I think this was true in the first century, according to Jewish law, genealogically speaking, anybody whose mother was Jewish is Jewish. It doesn't matter what the identity of the father was, ethnically speaking, but anybody born of a Jewish mother is Jewish. But I would say that that's only one factor, and it's not necessarily the main factor either. I think the main factor really is that when the only historical sources that we have for Jesus' life are the Gospels, and even they are highly problematic if we want to use them as historical sources. But they are unanimous in portraying Jesus as doing Jewish things. He observes the Sabbath, he observes festivals, talks about dietary laws, and there's no contrary image of him other than as somebody who really lives a Jewish life the way that other people lived a Jewish life. And it's really for that reason that we need to take his Jewishness as the default. That's just the starting point. That's simply not up for debate in any way. The matrilineal descent seals that. I mean, whatever people might think about Jesus, who his father was, and of course there would be different views on that. There's no dispute that someone named Mary, who was somebody, a Jewish young woman who lived in the Galilee, there's nobody disputes that she was Jewish. And so, if we want to go with we can use matrilineal descent also as a criterion.
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really important consideration that people need to make. And you did highlight in your answer that the Gospels are problematic from a certain perspective, because one of the emphases of the next quest, and this has been true, I think, even with, the so-called third questers, is that we have to understand that the Gospels are a part of the reception history of Jesus as well. So the Gospels aren't kind of these uninterpreted, unmediated windows into what the historical Jesus was doing. They reflect the biases and the beliefs and the traditions of the people that constructed them and the way that they understood the traditions that are contained in them. And we have to just understand that that's a part of the historical reality here. So there might be someone that would say, well, even for somebody like, maybe, and I know that all of these questions are up for debate, but let's say that someone like Luke is writing for a primarily Gentile audience. What can the Gospels reveal to us about the Jewishness of Jesus, given the fact that they've been influenced, at least in part, by the traditions of the later church?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But again, they're unanimous in their portrayal of Jesus as doing Jewish things. And Luke, more than some of the others, even though, we can debate who Luke's audience was, we don't actually know. But Luke is the only gospel that tells us that Jesus was circumcised. Well, certainly he was circumcised, because that was, it's not just a part of Jewish law, it's part of practice, still today for most Jewish families. And it certainly was in Luke's time and in Jesus' time as well. He also tells us about Jesus going up to the temple with his parents, with Mary and Joseph, at around the age of 12, which may or may not have been a kind of, anachronistically might call a bar mitzvah. We don't really know. But there was a relation to the rituals having to do with the temple, including sacrifices after the birth of a child and so on. So it's actually interesting that Luke, provides us or includes those details in his story of Jesus' young life when the other Gospels don't. Now, we don't really know any of this. I think I mentioned in the article that there are very few things that we know for sure and that we can take as a baseline. One is that Jesus did exist as a historical being. I sometimes get asked this, did Jesus really exist, or how can we prove that Jesus really existed? Well, I don't know how we can prove it, but I think the onus really is on those who want to disprove it. I think we just accept that he was a historical individual. The other thing that we can accept is that he was baptized by John the Baptist. And that's because the Gospels are uncomfortable with it, with that. And the last thing we might say is that he was crucified. These are, baptism and crucifixion, these are not elements that somebody would have made up, that the tradition would have created, because they had to be explained or explained away. So if we take those as baseline, the next important thing would be his Jewishness. There is nothing, we might not know the specifics of it, but everything that is recounted about Jesus fits into what we know about first century Jewish life from other sources. So, we don't know in terms of, did he really say this when the Pharisees asked him that? Or did he really, heal people on the Sabbath and then justify it by saying that his Father is working and he is working, as the Gospel of John says? Did those things really happen? I have no idea. But they're all within the realm of Sabbath observance, of holiday observance, of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, things that were standard for Jews in the first century.
And you also have this really weird dynamic within New Testament scholarship. And a lot of this starts in the 1970s when biblical scholars realized that they had to at least set Jesus against his Jewish background, where New Testament scholars would make attempts to kind of like grade Jesus's Jewishness, like
Right.
how Jewish is Jesus actually. And so I think like the two greatest examples of that, at least from the scholars that I've read, is, John Meyer has an entire series called Jesus, the Marginal Jew. And then N.T. Wright was very fond of saying that Jesus was very, very Jewish. So just talk to us about that dynamic in New Testament scholarship, like why the grading of Jesus's Jewishness, and how do we get past that in the future?
Okay. Well, I would say two things about that. One is that the grading of Jesus' Jewishness is an offshoot of the claim that Jesus has to be unique. And so there is this tension between seeing Jesus as a Jewish man from the Galilee, doing Jewish things the way other Galilean Jewish men did, on the one hand, and on the other hand, having to see him as somehow unique and over against his background somehow, as a universal figure because of the theological claims of Christianity. So the attempt to grade Jesus' Jewishness is part of that conversation. But the other point is that many of these scholars don't know as much about Judaism as they should. And so they assume that Judaism, that people's Jewish identity can be evaluated according to the degree to which they participate in Jewish religious life, Jewish religious rituals, and so on. And so they might say, well, somebody who doesn't go to synagogue every week, or who doesn't refrain from eating bread on Passover and all these things, well, they're not very Jewish. And there might be Jews who talk about themselves like that too. But that's not how Judaism works. Judaism is not encompassed by religious precepts and activities. There are many people, many Jews, who don't participate in any religious activities whatsoever. They'll never go to synagogue. They won't engage in any of the practices. and yet they'll be Jewish. And there's no, within a Jewish context, you can't be more Jewish or less Jewish. You're just Jewish. You might be more religious or less religious. You might be more observant, more orthodox, or more reform, or any number of other things, but you're the same Jewish, whether you do any of these things or not. And so I think that a lot of the evaluation has to do with a complete misunderstanding of what Jewish identity is about, and is based on the assumption that Jewish identity is like some sort of Christian identity that the people who are talking like this are familiar with.
Yeah.
But I see that, I've seen it in all kinds of discussions, not just historical Jesus, Jesus, good Jew, bad Jew, or, medium Jew, 3/4 Jew, not just there, but in other kinds of conversations as well, having to do with early Jewish-Christian relations. It's simply, Jewish identity is not commensurate with religious observance.
Yeah, let me maybe ask you an institutional question that crossed my mind here. So you've been in academia for a really long time, and
Thanks for rubbing that in. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in an accomplished kind of way, right? But you know how the academic institutions work, and
Yes.
I would imagine that especially if you go to a conservative evangelical university, you could probably earn a PhD in biblical studies, and maybe you take a class on Josephus. Maybe you take a class on Second Temple Judaism, but a lot of your instruction is going to be specifically in Christian theology as it relates to the Bible. Is that one of the institutional reasons why there are these scholars that just don't understand Second Temple Judaism?
I think that's part of it. But if you're thinking about scholars like N.T. Wright and others, whatever their education was, they also have access to a lot of books and people, and it's not that it's a part of it is Christian education, I suppose. Part of it is also the orientation, the theological or confessional orientation of whatever where everyone had one's training. But part of it is simply not being tuned into Jewishness, contemporary Jewishness even. And so there are ways to do that. You can talk to Jews. You can read about Judaism from people who actually are focused on Jewish studies as opposed to Jewish background to New Testament, things like that. That's something that I do find lacking. So I went to McMaster University in Canada in the 70s, and I studied New Testament with E.P. Sanders, and he was my thesis supervisor.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was very cool. And that's really, he had a lot to do with, why I became interested in becoming a New Testament scholar. And this was just at the time that he had submitted. I began the semester that he submitted Paul and Palestinian Judaism, his magnum opus, to the publisher. And I studied Paul with him. Now, he was responsible for organizing the graduate program at McMaster. And it was very important to him that Judaism not be studied as background to the New Testament, but that early Judaism be studied in its own right as a rich and viable, religious tradition and texts and history and all the rest of it. And I really absorbed that, of course, having come from a Jewish studies background myself. But I think that part of the problem is that approach has not been institutionalized in Christian seminaries. And so you still have Judaism being studied as background to New Testament, sometimes as a foil, as a negative foil to Jesus, Paul, and Christianity. Instead of understanding and really understanding, not just giving lip service to, but really understanding that Judaism of the time was its own thing, and that Judaism now is its own thing. Jewish identity is much more complex, as I've already mentioned, than religious identity, and sometimes has nothing to do with that. But it's also has nothing to do with Christianity. So, I've argued this in many contexts that although Christianity, because of its history, really has to take Judaism into account in some way, theologically and historically as well. But that's not the same is not true of Judaism. Historically, perhaps, yes, because of the history of Jewish-Christian relations, the history of Christian anti-Semitism, but theologically, no. And I think that many people don't really understand that there's that tendency either to elide Judaism and Christianity in the Jewish Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a highly problematic formulation. So either to elide them like that, or to see them as parallel but opposed to one another. And I think that in part helps to account for why there's such a poor understanding of Judaism and of Jesus' Jewishness among many New Testament scholars, but also pastors and other people involved in Christian education.
Yeah, and this can be really hard to grasp for a lot of people. Like I was raised in the Lutheran Church, and the next question I want to ask you is kind of directly related to that, because I know that there was this sense in which when we read the Gospels, Jesus is always in conflict with the Jewish leaders of his time, whether it's the Pharisees or the Sadducees, and it's over issues of the law and practice and things like that. And so the way that a lot of Christians, especially in the Lutheran tradition, have tended to read those passages in the gospel is that Jesus is in opposition to Judaism. There's some defect within Judaism to which Jesus is responding. But I think you argue very eloquently in this chapter, and I think it's just a historical truth, that this isn't about Jesus being anti-Jewish. This is just showing the distinctives of Jesus as an individual. So maybe walk my audience through that. How does that all work?
Okay, well, we have to understand, first of all, that there's no one single type of Judaism ever. And that was as true in the time of Jesus as it is today. There was always discussion, controversy, disagreements around how to observe, how to be Jewish. What it means to be Jewish. How one observes the Sabbath. What does it mean to refrain from work on the Sabbath, which is a major issue? So we see, the evidence that we have from the first century is that there was a lively discussion among various groups about these issues. So when the Gospels show Jesus in controversy with Pharisees or with Sadducees or with, translation is sometimes lawyers, specialists in the law, he's simply participating in the kind of discourse that was going on among people who were involved in leadership in the Jewish community in one way or another. So it's not that he's distinct from everybody else. It's that he's participating in a conversation that everybody else is participating in. So when he's arguing about, what does it mean to observe the Sabbath? What about healing on the Sabbath? What about if somebody's starving, plucking grain from a field that you're going through? So he's involved in a conversation around what are the limitations of work, right? The Hebrew Bible says, you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments say that. But the question is, what does it mean to do work? How do we define work? And there were different ways of doing that among these different groups, in the Jewish groups in the first century. Another very clear example has to do with divorce. The Bible, the Book of Deuteronomy has a very short section on divorce that just talks about a man giving a woman a writ of divorce. But it doesn't explain on what grounds can one have divorce, what should be in the writ, all of these different things. And there was a controversy, a well-documented controversy in Jewish literature of the time around the conditions for divorce. And Jesus' views on divorce line up with other people's, not everybody's, but with one of the factions in that argument. So we have to understand that all of these issues, it's not that Jesus was saying, don't observe the Sabbath, don't observe the pilgrimage festivals, don't observe the law, the dietary laws. He wasn't saying those things at all, but he was participating in a conversation, in a discussion, sometimes heated discussion, that others were engaging in as well around how one does those things. So I think that would be the way to understand that. So it's not that he's in opposition to Judaism, but he's engaged in Judaism. He's engaged in the conversations that other Jewish leaders were at that time.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of funny to make a historical analogy here that modern Christians, like, man, especially online, modern Christians just argue with each other about everything all the time. And
Right.
the assumption is that, like, if you disagree with somebody on a particular issue, it's not that, like, you're somehow, I mean, I guess there are some people that think that they're a better Christian than someone they disagree with or whatever. But, like, the assumption is not that if you disagree with someone, they're not a Christian or that you're somehow rejecting Christianity. We're debating these really complex issues, and Jesus is just doing the same thing.
That's exactly right. And we do that within all of our communities, whether they're religious communities or, like in a university department debating on, what should be the shape of the undergraduate program or the graduate program. There are different opinions. I mean, that's just how we engage with one another in community, especially when there's a striving for some sort of consensus around belief or practice of various sorts.
Yeah, and I had Helen Bond on a couple of weeks ago to talk about her chapter on the Gospels as biography, and which was brilliant. I absolutely love that way of looking at the Gospels. But it's just kind of harmonizing what she says about the nature of the Gospels as a form of ancient Greek biography and what you're saying here about Jesus's engagement with the Pharisees. You would say that the Gospel writers, even as biographers, given the reception history challenges and everything that we have to take into consideration, the Gospel writers as biographers just assume, all of them do, that Jesus was a Jew and that all of these controversies are taking place within a Jewish context, right?
Yes, absolutely. Even the most vicious ones, like in Matthew 23, when Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees, even those are inner Jewish, conflicts and debates. And we find evidence of those similar sorts of things in Josephus, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other literature that we know from that same era.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Paul and the Gentile mission, and knowing that you trained under E.P. Sanders, I think you're primed to answer this question here. But there are many people that would say, okay, yes, we'll situate Jesus within his Jewish context, but certainly Paul is responsible for what has been called the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. And of course, Pauline scholarship has done a lot to try to disrupt that thesis of Pauline interpretation. So where does Paul and the wider Gentile mission fit into this dynamic? And then what does that tell us about the inherent Jewishness of Jesus?
Well, I'm not sure it tells us anything about the inherent Jewishness of Jesus. I think Paul was engaged in something quite different than what we associate with Jesus according to the Gospels. Now, first of all, there is a very strong tendency, not universally accepted, but very vocal anyway, to situate Paul very firmly within Judaism. There is this slogan now, Paul within Judaism. And the proponents of that view, which I find quite compelling, argue that what Paul is doing is finding a way for Gentiles to enter into a Jewish covenantal relationship with God. And that the reason that he doesn't want them to be circumcised and doesn't really want them to observe the law, the dietary laws and so on, is because he had an apocalyptic mindset. Christ was going to return any minute now. There was no need to change anything about the present moment. So that is not exactly what I learned under E.P. Sanders in the 70s, but that is a perspective that I think has been very helpful as a corrective to the view that Paul was a convert, or that Paul rejected Judaism, or that Paul kind of demonized Judaism or saw it as dead and, no longer viable, which was then picked up by Luther and others as a perspective on Judaism. But Paul doesn't really relate to the historical Jesus. And it's an interesting question as to what he actually knows. And he doesn't know very much. He knows that that Jesus was crucified. He knows that he had a teaching about divorce. but he doesn't know that much else, or at least his letters don't give any other information. I think that Paul presumes the Jewishness of Jesus, but doesn't really focus on it. And why should he? I don't think it was something that he questioned. But he also, I don't think, gives us information about it.
Yeah. I've been doing some research on First Thessalonians over the last couple of weeks, and it's really frustrating that in several places in Paul's letter, he tells his audience, "Hey, remember when I was with you and I gave you all these traditions?
Right.
You need to continue to believe in those." But he never actually outlines what those traditions are. I mean, my theory about this, and you can tell me if you think that I'm wrong, but my theory is that at least some of the oral traditions that made their way into the Gospels had to be a part of what Paul was communicating to his audience. And if those oral traditions reflected Jesus's Jewish identity, then that makes it, I think, even more likely that Paul would have just, again, like the writers of the Gospels, assumed Jesus's Jewishness, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I don't know how we would know that.
Yeah.
I mean, whether Paul knew other things or not, I just don't think we can say. I mean, it's very clear that in 1 Corinthians, when the Corinthians are asking Paul all these questions, what about this? What about that? And he responds, should somebody who's a follower of Christ divorce their pagan spouse, or, so he's got all kinds of answers to these questions. But the only one that he says, not I, but this is from the Lord, is the one about divorce. We don't know what else he knew or whatever else he passed along. But I think we can safely assume that he just took it for granted that Jesus was Jewish. We don't need Paul to confirm that. There is no way really to confirm that. So, but it seems logical because Paul is also writing at a time when Christianity isn't a thing yet. There's a Jesus movement. There's the Jerusalem church that is, that he's kind of, that is irritated with him and he's irritated with them, according to Galatians. So there are, and he's doing something with the Gentile mission and so on, but you don't have a religion called Christianity. And to suggest that Paul is responsible for the parting of the ways, I just don't know how we can historically support that. The whole question of when the ways parted, how they parted, why they parted is very much up in the air, up for grabs right now. And I think the only thing we might really say is that it was a process that would have taken place over quite a long period of time and would have had a different set of circumstances in different places throughout the Roman Empire. Now, it could be that the Pauline letters provided some ammunition or some proof text or whatever for those that were interested in promoting a separation between Jews and Christians or Jews and Christ followers. But we shouldn't tie the parting of the ways so closely to Paul. I don't think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. There has been another strand of scholarship that has associated the parting of the ways with the Gospel of John.
Yes.
Obviously, John is the probably this is all historical probability, but John is most likely the last of the Gospels to be written. And I was talking to Helen about this too in our episode. I'm man enough to admit that I get very frustrated with the Gospel of John, and I feel like sometimes our understanding of early Christianity would be much easier if John just didn't exist, because it creates so many historical complications from the picture we receive from the synoptics. But there is this phrase in the Gospel of John that has been almost universally appropriated by people that have downplayed the Jewishness of Jesus. And that's the fact that the writer of the Gospel of John in his narrative refers to the opponents of Jesus as the Jews, hoi judaoi in Greek. And this has been a really big problem that a lot of people have not had a good explanation for. Now, you've done a lot of work on the Gospel of John. And again, There's just a million historical questions I have about why it is the way that it is and why it has to be so much different. But talk to us about that phrase, the Jews and John. What is he getting at there? And how is this not at least by the narrator of John, a rejection of Jesus and his relationship to Judaism?
Okay, well, again, we need to start with the portrayal of Jesus. The Gospel of John portrays Jesus engaging in a lot of Jewish things, even more so than than the synoptics, I would say. He has Jesus go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals. There are 3 pilgrimage festivals mandated by in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, and the Gospel of John. The narrative is punctuated by Jesus going up to Jerusalem for the festivals. There's a reference in the story of the wedding at Cana to Jewish rites of purification. It's one of the earliest references that we have to that particular ritual, and there's no problem with that whatsoever. Jesus does not reject his Jewish identity. But what the Gospel of John has done is redefine Jewish, not Jewishness, but the label Jew, Judaioi, the Greek term, as by and large as the enemies of Jesus. That means as Jews who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what the Gospel of John has done. And at the same time, it doesn't it doesn't find Jesus' portrayal as doing Jewish things as problematic. Now, the usage of the term Judaio is very interesting. It's used sometimes in a neutral way to refer to Jewish rituals, for the Jewish rites of purification, for example, or the Jewish festival of Passover, and sometimes referring to groups of Jews that were kind of interested in Jesus. It's also used negatively to in some of the discourses where Jesus is criticizing the Judaioi for not believing in him and not believing that he's the fulfillment of Scripture. It never uses the term Judaios for the disciples, and it uses it only once for Jesus, and that's in the mouth of the Samaritan woman. So the Samaritan woman in chapter 4 says to Jesus, how is it that you, a Judaios, is asking me, a Samaritan woman, for water? Now, it's interesting that Jesus, in that story, he doesn't really respond to that. He doesn't say he's a Judaios, and he doesn't say he's not. But what he does is he goes and he redefines, tries to bring her to an understanding that he's the Messiah. So whether he's a Judaios or not is not the crucial thing. So what John has done, in my opinion, is use the term Judaios primarily as a negative term. And that's because he is trying to differentiate his understanding of Christ belief from the Judaioi who don't believe. So it's a rhetorical move as opposed to a historical move. So we always get into trouble when we try to figure out what is the historical referent of Judaios in the Gospel of John. And I would respond to that and say, it's a rhetorical term, not a historical term. The disciples are clearly Jews. Jesus is clearly a Jew. But the term Judaios is used in a particular way to make a particular point. So I would say that John is paving a way for a parting of the ways by using the term Judaios in this way. But he's not using it to reflect on Jesus' ethnic identity. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't care about that. For him, the important thing about Jesus is that he is the Messiah and the Son of God. And so he doesn't have problems portraying Jesus as doing Jewish things, which makes sense because he's operating in a Jewish context, according to the story, of course.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to circle back for my last question about the Gospels in particular. I want to circle back to the Synoptic Gospels because you had this really interesting section in your chapter that I'd never considered before, where you make the case that because the Gospel writers just assumed the Jewish identity of Jesus, the crucifixion narratives had to be crafted in a way that led to his death. That there's a relationship between the crucifixion narratives and Jesus's Jewish identity. Just explain that to my audience for me.
Okay, well, it's really just a kind of a simple narrative point that Jesus is portrayed as a Jewish man from Galilee who mostly, in the synoptics, almost entirely, was active in the Galilee. He wandered around from place to place. He did his healings. He did his, uttered his parables. And that was within a very circumscribed area. And then, however, he is crucified at the Passover by a Roman governor. And so you have to connect those two ideas. And so the Gospels have to account for the fact that a man from the Galilee, a Jewish guy from the Galilee, somehow ends up being crucified in Jerusalem at the Passover by the Roman governor. And so one way to do that is to portray Jesus as gathering such a large following that his following becomes a threat to the Roman governor. That's one way to do it. Or another way to do it is to say, well, he was such a pain in the thorn in the side, a pain in the neck to the Jewish leadership that they were so worried about him or worried about his impact that they then, whispered in the ear of the Roman governor and had him crucified. But I think it's a narrative problem. It's a problem having to do with telling the story, that you have to then somehow explain how it is that this person ends up here when it doesn't seem like a natural sort of thing to happen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we've covered a lot of ground about the basics of the Jewish identity of Jesus as far as we can tell from the information that we have in the New Testament. I want to ask you just a couple of broad questions to wrap up today. For modern interpreters that fail to really think through the significance of the Jewish identity of Jesus, what's lost in those interpretations?
Well, I think that they lose actually an understanding of who Jesus might have been as a historical individual. There's always there's a tension inherent in Christianity. I think we see it already in the early sources between Jesus as a human being and the impact that he might have had on the people around him at the time, and Jesus as the Christ, as this kind of idea, this highly theologized figure. And all the arguments around, what is the relationship to God the Father, and, all of these things that happened, for example, in the 4th century around the Council of Nicaea and all those other things. If you don't pay adequate attention to Jesus' Jewishness, you lose almost everything about what you might understand about him as a historical individual. And this very basic question as to what was his impact on the people around him. And why was it that some people actually, at least the disciples, were so devoted to him that even when he died, which should have kind of invalidated all of their ideas about him, they went on to basically, lay the groundwork for what became Christianity? That's a very important question. So I think if we don't acknowledge Jesus' Jewishness, or even more than that, kind of get a feel for what that might have meant in its first century context, we lose our ability to understand him as a human being, which I think is a big loss.
Yeah. How do you think that your chapter is, I think it's well worth reading. Everyone needs to read it and internalize it. And I agree with your thesis. We just have to assume that Jesus is a Jew moving forward. How does that align with some of the other proposals that are being made by NextQuest scholars?
Well, I don't know all the other proposals because I haven't worked my way through the, I don't know how many hundreds of pages
Like 600. It's a lot.
Yeah. So I don't really know, but I think that the whole enterprise was really meant to accomplish a few things. And one was to um, think about the historical Jesus in a way that differs quite a bit from previous quests, that moves away from some of the assumptions, that doesn't require all kinds of unprovable ideas about the historicity of the Gospels and things like that. And a big part of that is to put him into his historical setting, which is, what I was really focusing on in my chapter. But another part of it would be to, as Helen Bond's essay, understanding the genre of the Gospels. What are we really dealing with in that genre? And how can we then assess or begin to, think about their representations of Jesus, as reception history and putting together whatever it is that they heard and that they thought about. So I think that context is a huge piece of it. And the other piece, I think, is to not be seduced by the need to see Jesus as unique from a historical perspective. I think that the previous quests are really addressing that question, assuming that the growth of Christianity, the emergence and the growth of Christianity had to do with Jesus' uniqueness, which is what gets you into trouble when you want to think about Jesus' Jewishness. And I think the next quest as a whole is trying to counteract that.
Yeah. Now, the last question I want to ask you, and I know that it is impossible to predict the future, but I want to ask you about kind of the direction of biblical scholarship. And a lot has changed even over the last 20 and 30 years. And I couldn't imagine taking someone like Rudolf Bultmann or Ernst Käsemann and dropping them off in 2015 or 2016. I think that they wouldn't, I don't even know if they'd be able to comprehend the direction that biblical scholarship went in. So it's very difficult to plot this. But considering that there does seem to be, I would say in Pauline studies, it has to do a lot with kind of the contextual social scientific approach to Paul's letters and trying to situate him in the Greco-Roman world. And then you have the next quest proposals within Jesus studies. It does seem like there's a lot of momentum and change happening in the field right now. So in 20, 30, 40 years, where do you see the field of biblical scholarship?
Well, I mean, the way I see the field of biblical scholarship now is maybe more fragmented than what you are describing. And right now, I think we're seeing two kind of very general trends. One is represented by the next quest, a kind of real attempt to rethink the relationship between early Judaism and early Christianity, a real attempt to understand the Jesus movement as a Jewish movement, and then to understand the historical processes that led to Christianity becoming its own thing. That's one trend. But we also see a lot of a kind of retrenchment of what I would consider theologically driven historical work. That is, scholars whose stated aims are historical, but whose historical conclusions seem, at least to somebody like me, theologically shaped. And I mean, you see this in Gospel of John stuff all the time. There's a very strong apologetic strand within Johannine scholarship. The Gospel of John appeals very strongly to conservative Christian perspectives. So, how this is going to play out in the next 20, 30 years, I think will also depend on how, on Christian education, whether that will begin to incorporate some of the insights of a next quest perspective or not, whether people trained that way are able to convey those understandings and those insights into the congregations and educational settings in which they will work. We don't really know that. And some of this is also related to larger political trends within North America and Europe, and we can't really separate all those strands out. So what'll be in the next 20, 30 years, I really don't know. But what I see now is that there is a kind of messiness and bifurcation as well, of scholars going in different directions, some of that being confessionally driven.
Yeah. Well, man, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. But again, I would highly encourage all of my listeners, and I know that this is a subject that's near and dear to me. If you can get a copy of the book and read the chapter, you absolutely should. You have to take the Jewishness of Jesus seriously as a starting point and as a baseline. Dr. Adele Reinhartz, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this issue with my audience today. Before I let you go, where can people find your work or follow you, or where can they engage with what you've produced?
Well, I've written a ton of stuff. So some of which you can find just by Googling my name. So you can get access to some of it that way. It's in a lot of libraries, the books and articles that I've written, a lot of things available for download. I'm on Blue Sky, or however one pronounces that network, and reachable there on Facebook. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways. But, Google is a good place to start. And some things will be available right there.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Reinhartz, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.